So I decided to do my final podcast on the Kingsley Plantation Historical Site. We visited the site earlier in the semester. We went back in February, and it was a really cool opportunity, I thought, because while we were touring, they were hosting a historical festival. So we got to see people all dressed up in period costumes, conducting the chores that would have made up the everyday life of the plantation. So we saw them cooking over an open flame. They were making candles by hand. They were doing an in-depth process of doing laundry, it looked like. And so it was really cool because we got to see these people doing these things while we were hearing the stories of the plantation and learning about the plantation. And it really made it come to life in a really cool way. And it really helps me understand better what it would have been like in its heyday to be on that plantation. So I really enjoyed the tour. I took my dad back a couple weeks later, actually, and he really enjoyed the place as well. So I'm excited to just discuss today, what they were doing on the plantation, what its purpose was, and why it was significant to the larger picture of Florida history. The history of the Kingsley Plantation is really interesting. It changed hands a couple of different times while it was in use during the plantation period, which lasted from about the 1760s up to emancipation in 1865. Its namesake, Zephaniah Kingsley, moved there in 1814, and he also brought along his wife and three children. They would later have a fourth child who was born on the plantation. And what's really interesting about Zephaniah Kingsley and his family is that he was married to a former slave, one of his own former slaves. Her name was Anna, and she hailed from Senegal in Africa, West Africa, that is. And she was purchased by Kingsley in the slave trade in 1806. And, he obviously, after a while, married her, had a few kids, and she actively pursued a role in managing the plantation, which had a lot of implications that we'll come to see later on in the presentation. So this was really a rare thing to happen, first of all, for someone to marry a former slave, and then also to let her have such a large role in running the plantation. Anna would eventually be freed by Kingsley in 1811, but she stayed with him and acquired her own land and reaped the benefits of being a free woman. So the site itself is located on Fort George Island in northeast Florida, and at any given time there could be 60 to 80 slaves who lived and worked on the plantation. And what they were mostly doing was growing and selling cash crops of the day, especially Sea Island cotton. Sea Island cotton was very rare in that it could only grow in certain climates along the Atlantic coast of the Americas, and Fort George Island was one such place that was conducive to growing it. So they really emphasized the growth of sea island cotton as well as other Florida industries such as citrus, sugarcane, and corn. The slave cabins were actually occupied until the early 1900s, and there's one here that's pictured on the bottom right. They really represent an interesting part of this site because they're very indicative of the African heritage of these slaves. They were set up in a semicircular pattern, which was adopted from the way that a lot of West African villages were set up. And although they were quite small, usually 17 by 11 feet, they housed up to 8 people at a time. So a lot of the social life that went on in the slave quarters didn't happen inside of these cabins. They happened in the dooryard, in the front yard, where there was more space to accommodate people. There's a picture in the upper left that is a model of one of the rooms in the main house. Obviously, the main house was separate from the slave quarters, and it was divided by a concrete wall in the middle of the site. And what was interesting about the main house here was that Anna, the wife, had her own space in the house, which was very rare for even a white woman to have space apart from her husband in the main house of a plantation. She could receive guests. She could be by herself. She really did exercise a lot of independence that was rare to a woman in her position for the time. The purpose of Kingsley Plantation, was the same as every other antebellum plantation in America. They wanted to generate money and lots of it. So they did this at Kingsley through cash crops. I mentioned some before, such as the sea island cotton and the corn, but another one that they grew here was indigo. And you can see the indigo paraphernalia on this particular slide. The box that's in the bottom right hand corner is where they would have a slave basically just stepping on raw indigo to get out the dyes and just harness what they were really going for to sell, which was just the beautiful, rich indigo color. And not that any particular job as a slave was super fun or really preferable. This really seemed like probably one of the worst jobs you could have on this plantation. And while it's not very physically demanding, these people were always dyed blue, for one thing, and rather than just being aesthetically displeasing, they were inhaling toxic fumes all day that really damaged their respiratory system and led to just horrible respiratory diseases for these people to deal with, and they usually died very early. But that is just one of the ways that slaves were treated. Just because this place was run by a former slave woman doesn't mean that horrible atrocities and things didn't occur. They very much did so here, and this is one such example of that happening. So ultimately, the significance of the Kingsley Plantation is really twofold. So this is a great example of a plantation that incorporated African traditions. This certainly was not the case in much of the antebellum South. The slaves on Kingsley Plantation were able to adapt and continue a lot of the traditions and customs, that they brought over from Africa. And we see this, as I mentioned, in the construction of the slave cabins. They did use the circular pattern, and they used tabby methods, which were distinctly African. But we also see this in the burial ritual, and that took place under the tree that's pictured on the left side of this slide. There's a giant tree in the middle of the site, and all around it, in a circular pattern, once again, there are slaves buried underneath of it. That is how they did it in West African villages, especially in Senegal, where Anna is from. And they were able to continue that custom here, which is definitely not the case in other parts of the South. And so these traditions were able to be adopted and continued because Zephaniah Kingsley was married to a former slave who had a role in the running of this plantation. And just the fact that these traditions survived and the fact that Zephaniah even ever married Anna really shows the duality of slavery in America. There's this huge, undeniable essence of white supremacy and patriarchy, but here we have an example where, that's not necessarily the case. There is a black woman, a black former slave, who really has a lot of influence and power over other slaves. So this site is immensely interesting. You go and you see all kinds of different influence there, from the Spanish work system to African customs and influences. So it's really important to Florida history because we really see how slavery in this region was so different from that in, say, Virginia or South Carolina, where something like this probably would have never been able to happen. But yeah, it's a great site. I really enjoyed it. I'll probably go back again in the next few weeks. I'll probably try and go. So this has been a great semester, and I really appreciate all the wisdom you've imparted on us. So yeah, have a great summer.